Before we begin, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. That way, you won't miss any stories that reveal what many places have tried to hide for decades. And now, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? Your city may hold secrets as silent as this castle. The castle stood atop the hill, like an ancient scar on the landscape. Its grey stone towers pierced the sky, indifferent to the passing decades. It wasn't listed in tourist guides, didn't appear on common maps, and was rarely mentioned by the locals. Yet, everyone knew of its existence, and everyone avoided talking about it. Ethan Caldwell watched the construction from the back seat of his car, feeling an unease he couldn't explain. A historian specializing in abandoned properties and disputed inheritances, he had visited dozens of forgotten mansions, disused hospitals and ruined farms scattered across the country. Nothing, however, compared to this structure. There was something about the way the castle seemed to observe those who approached, not like a building, but like something attentive, patient. The invitation to visit was unexpected. A formal letter, signed by a Boston law firm, informed Ethan that he had been hired to assess the historical and structural authenticity of the property before its possible reopening to the public. The current owner, a reclusive man named Arthur Whitmore, was rarely seen and had never given interviews. Even so, he had invested large sums in the minimal maintenance of the castle, preventing it from completely collapsing. Upon reaching the iron gates, Ethan noticed no signs of typical neglect, no graffiti, no vegetation overtaking the walls. Everything was too intact, too well preserved. As if someone were watching over the place with excessive rigor, but without allowing it to truly come back to life. The creaking of the gates as they opened echoed across the hill, breaking the silence abruptly. A tall, thin man waited on the other side. He wore sober clothes, too old to be considered fashionable, but clean and perfectly fitted. His gaze was firm, almost invasive. "Mr. Caldwell," he said without smiling, "I'm Thomas Hale. I've been taking care of this place longer than most people realize." Without offering further explanation, Thomas led Ethan through the inner courtyard. Each step produced a dry echo, amplified by the high walls. The air was cold, even under the afternoon sun. Ethan noticed small marks on the stones, almost imperceptible grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly over the years. The castle did not follow the American architectural style. Its foundations resembled 13th-century European fortresses, which in itself raised numerous questions. Official documents indicated that the construction dated from the late 19th century, but that clearly did not match what Ethan saw. Inside the castle, the atmosphere became even more oppressive. Long, narrow corridors, illuminated only by windows too high to allow a clear view of the outside. Ancient tapestries covered parts of the walls, depicting scenes difficult to interpret. Human figures in rigid positions, blank faces, hands raised in gestures that did not seem celebratory. Thomas walked ahead, maintaining a steady pace, as if he knew every irregularity in the ground. He didn't explain anything, didn't comment on the details that caught Ethan's eye. He simply led. The first room examined was the old main hall. A solid wood table occupied the center of the space, surrounded by heavy chairs, all aligned with exaggerated precision. There was no dust, no sign of neglect. Yet the atmosphere conveyed the feeling that no one had sat there for a long time, not out of disuse, but by choice. Ethan approached the table and noticed deep marks on the surface, as if sharp objects had been repeatedly driven into the same spot. When he ran his fingers over the marks, he felt an involuntary shiver. "And there have been events here," he commented, more to himself than to Thomas. "There were decisions," the man finally corrected, "and consequences." The answer hung in the air, too heavy to ignore. Ethan realized in that instant that his presence there wasn't merely technical. It wasn't just about assessing walls, foundations, or old documents. He had been summoned for another reason, one he didn't yet fully understand. While jotting down observations in her notebook, one detail caught her attention. There were no mirrors anywhere. Not in the living room, not in the hallways, not in the bedrooms they began to visit next. It was a glaring, almost intentional absence. "Does the owner avoid reflections?" Ethan asked. Thomas stopped walking. He turned slowly and stared at Ethan for several long seconds before answering. "Some places prefer not to be seen in their entirety." The sentence ended any attempt at conversation. Silence returned to dominate the castle, but now it seemed denser, as if each wall held fragments of stories that should never be revisited. As he climbed a spiral staircase leading to the upper towers, Ethan felt for the first time an unsettling certainty. This castle was not merely preserved, it was waiting, hoping that someone would finally ask the right questions. The morning light barely filtered through the castle's narrow windows when Ethan resumed his inspection. The place seemed different at this hour, no longer menacing, but watchful, as if every corridor were attentive to his footsteps, registering his presence with ancient patience. Thomas waited motionless in the inner courtyard, clutching a bunch of heavy keys. The metallic sound echoed with every slightest movement, breaking the silence with an almost ritualistic weight. Without exchanging a word, he led Ethan to a wing that had not yet been explored. This part of the castle contrasted sharply with the rest. The walls displayed marks of old repairs, made with techniques that were not common in 19th-century American architecture. There was a clear attempt to preserve something much older than official records suggested. "This wing doesn't appear in the documents I received," Ethan commented, observing the stone arches. "Many records have been corrected," Thomas replied, pushing open a heavy door. "Not everything survives on paper." The room revealed itself to be an old library. Tall bookshelves filled with books with thick, worn covers covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Some volumes were locked with thin chains, as if they were not only rare, but dangerous. The smell of old paper mingled with a faint, difficult-to-identify metallic odor. Ethan began examining the records. Most were not listed in any known catalogues. They were private records, diaries, legal compilations, medical notes, and never-before-published correspondence. They all dated from different periods, but shared the same surname: Whitmore. Arthur Whitmore, the current owner, was merely the last link in a lineage that spanned generations. The castle was not just an architectural heritage, it was a legacy built on quiet decisions, kept away from the public eye. While leafing through one of the diaries, Ethan realized there were no typical personal accounts, no explicit emotions, romances, or intimate reflections. The entries described events in a cold, almost clinical way. Nighttime visits, restricted meetings, disappearances treated as administrative absences. "These people," Ethan began, but stopped short when he noticed Thomas watching him intently. "They weren't ordinary residents of the area," said the caretaker. "They came from far away, some by choice, others out of necessity." Gradually, the external setting began to connect with the silent narrative of the castle. The surrounding region had always been isolated, with little surveillance, ideal for discreet meetings. For decades, local authorities ignored unusual activities there, often out of convenience, sometimes out of fear. As they walked down a corridor adjacent to the library, Ethan noticed numbered doors, all closed. They didn't look like bedrooms. They were small, solid, with reinforced latches on the outside. "Files," Thomas said vaguely. But Ethan noticed deep marks on the floor in front of some doors, irregular scratches, as if something had been repeatedly forced against the wood from the inside. The castle was beginning to reveal itself not only as a historical monument, but as an organism shaped by the people who controlled it. Every space had a precise function. Nothing there was random. At the end of the corridor, a window offered a view of the distant village. Simple houses, narrow streets, and an old church dominated the landscape. The physical proximity contrasted sharply with the social distance. The castle had always been there, observing the village, while the village pretended it didn't exist. "Did they know?" Ethan asked, without taking his eyes off the village. "They knew enough not to ask," Thomas replied. "Silence, too, is an inheritance." Before leaving the wing, Thomas opened one last door. The room was empty, except for a wooden chair fixed to the floor and marks on the ceiling, as if chains had been fastened there for a long time. Ethan felt a weight in his stomach. This wasn't just the past. It was a system that had functioned efficiently for years, sustained by documents, agreements, and omissions. Upon leaving, he understood something fundamental. The antagonist of that story was not just one person, but an entire structure built to erase traces, control narratives, and preserve power. And he had just entered the center of it. Ethan spent the night in one of the few rooms designated for visitors. He didn't sleep well. The silence of the castle wasn't empty. It was active, laden with small, non-repeating sounds. A distant crack, a brief dragging, the echo of footsteps that never truly approached. When dawn broke, he was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, with the clear feeling that the castle wasn't ignoring his presence. Without waiting for Thomas, he decided to begin inspecting the lower areas on his own. Old maps indicated the existence of underground storage areas originally used for food storage, and later as auxiliary archives. Access was behind a discreet door at the end of a dimly lit corridor. The descending staircase was narrow and uneven. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air grew heavier. Upon reaching the lower level, Ethan immediately noticed something wrong. There were no signs of water damage, excessive mold, or structural deterioration. This area had been maintained with the same care as the rest of the castle, which made no sense, considering its supposedly secondary function. The underground rooms were overly organized. Shelves lined up, boxes numbered, records catalogued with almost obsessive precision. Upon opening one of the boxes, Ethan found medical files. Detailed reports, signed by professionals from different eras, describing physical and psychological evaluations of individuals identified only by initials. They were not official prisoners. They were not listed in any public database. Yet every detail was there. Approximate age, origin, behavior, physical stamina, reactions to prolonged isolation. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just historical negligence. It was something systemic. The sound of footsteps at the top of the stairs made him freeze. Thomas emerged slowly, placing his hand on the wall, as if he knew exactly where Ethan would be. "That area was not included in the agreement," he said, his voice firm but restrained. "It exists," Ethan replied, keeping his tone controlled. "And it's been used for decades. I can't ignore that." Thomas descended a few more steps, stopping a few meters away. His eyes showed no surprise, only weariness. "Some structures survive because they learn to adapt," he said. "The castle did that. The people who controlled it did too." Ethan carefully closed the folder. For the first time, he realized that Thomas wasn't just a caregiver. He was an active part of that system, perhaps not its creator, but its guardian. In the following days, the atmosphere in the castle changed. The doors that had previously been open were now kept locked. Thomas accompanied Ethan at all times, observing every note, every photograph taken for the technical report. Even so, Ethan continued investigating. He cross-referenced dates, names, and local historical events. He discovered that whenever a disappearance was reported in the region, there was a corresponding gap in the official records, lost documents, investigations prematurely closed, discredited witnesses. The castle didn't frighten him. It was his final destination. Tensions rose when Ethan found a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement. Inside, there was old containment equipment, obsolete medical instruments, and a metal table with deep marks of use. There was no blood, no human remains, only signs of repetition, of continuity. As he left the room, Thomas was waiting for him in the hallway. "You need to decide how far you want to go," he said. "Some truths weren't meant to be brought to the surface. They were kept buried to protect whom?" Ethan retorted. "The victims or those responsible?" Thomas didn't answer. He simply walked away, leaving the question to echo in the cold hallways. That night, Ethan tried to send some of his records to a contact outside the castle. The signal dropped repeatedly. The internet only worked for basic tasks. Any attempt at more demanding transmissions failed. That's when he realized the castle wasn't just a relic of the past. He still held sway. And now Ethan was part of the problem. Ethan's investigation was no longer silent. Even without direct confrontations, the castle reacted to his persistence in a subtle, almost strategic way. Small changes in routine began to appear, schedules altered without warning, areas previously accessible now closed, and the constant feeling of being watched, even when Thomas wasn't around. To understand the true extent of what he had found, Ethan decided to look beyond the walls. On a brief authorized excursion to the nearby village, he realized that his presence there had not gone unnoticed. Conversations ceased when he entered a shop. Eyes were averted. Suspicion was widespread. In the small municipal archive, an elderly employee hesitated before helping him. When she finally agreed, she brought out old, dusty boxes filled with incomplete reports and handwritten corrections. Names crossed out, dates altered, pages torn out. The pattern was clear. Whenever the castle appeared as a possible point of interest, the entry ended abruptly. A subplot was beginning to take shape there, the silent complicity of the village, not out of malice, but for survival. Ethan found references to an informal agreement made decades earlier. The castle generated jobs, maintained investments, and guaranteed economic stability. In exchange, no questions were asked. Another narrative thread emerged when Ethan located old records from a disused psychiatric clinic miles away. The documents indicated unofficial patient transfers, always coinciding with internal renovations or expansions of the castle. There were no court orders, only vague administrative authorizations. Back at the castle, Ethan confronted Thomas indirectly, mentioning the clinic during a seemingly casual conversation. The caretaker neither denied nor confirmed it. "Places like this survive because they become useful," he simply said. "For some, more than for others." Meanwhile, a new character began to stand out. Margaret Hale, who had died 20 years earlier, Thomas's sister. The few existing records indicated that she'd been a teacher in the village and, for a short period, responsible for organizing local historical archives. Her name appeared linked to attempts to standardize documents, attempts interrupted without explanation. Ethan found an unsent letter hidden among books in the castle library. Written by Margaret, it described her growing unease about what she had discovered. She spoke of people who came in and never left, and the constant pressure to forget. This personal subplot further complicated Thomas's character. He wasn't just an obedient guard, he was someone who had lost something or someone to that system. The time pressure began to intensify when Ethan received a brief email from the law firm handling the contract. The deadline for submitting the report had been moved forward, without justification, with no possibility of extension. The message was clear. He was getting too close. Inside the castle, documents began to disappear. Folders that Ethan had analyzed were no longer where they should be. Someone was retracing their steps, adjusting the scene, trying to regain control of the narrative. The subplots intertwined, the complicit village, the forgotten clinic, the silent sister, the rushed contract. All pointed to the same gravitational center, The castle as a key piece of a larger system protected by convenience, fear, and silence. Ethan understood that he wasn't just fighting against a place or a family. He was fighting against an entire network built to remain invisible, and time was running out to expose all of this. The change happened silently, almost imperceptibly. There were no shouts, no immediate confrontations. Just a detail out of place, too small to be ignored by someone accustomed to reading between the lines. Ethan was reviewing old notes in the library when he noticed a discrepancy that had previously escaped him. Among the Whitmore family diaries, a name appeared repeatedly in internal records, always associated with logistical decisions, special authorizations, and delicate transfers. A name that did not appear in absolutely any public document. Arthur Whitmore. The current owner of the castle was not merely a distant and reclusive heir, as legal records indicated. He appeared active in the documents from much earlier than would be chronologically possible. There were signatures attributed to him 40, 50 years ago, always identical, always precise. Ethan compared the strokes. There was no variation, no sign of natural aging in the handwriting. The revelation hit him hard. Either that name had been used by more than one person across generations, or something far more disturbing was being concealed. In either case, the official narrative crumbled. He was determined to find Thomas. The caretaker was in the inner courtyard, overseeing maintenance that didn't seem necessary. When Ethan mentioned the name, Thomas stopped immediately. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to deny it. Some functions are not inherited, he said after a long silence. They are maintained. Ethan pressed him. He demanded answers. Thomas, for the first time, seemed to age before him. Arthur Whitmore is not a man, he revealed. It's a position, an operational title, a name that can never disappear from the internal records because it guarantees continuity. The turning point was solidifying. The antagonist ceased to be a hidden figure and became a concept. An identity kept alive artificially, sustained by documents, signatures, and silent agreements. Thomas explained, without going into technical details, that the castle had been used for decades as a center for officially unrecognized behavioral studies. Parallel projects, funded by institutions that didn't want their names associated with ethical failings. When something went wrong, the castle absorbed the problem. When someone disappeared, the castle offered an invisible justification. Arthur Whitmore was the anchor. A name that allowed contracts to span generations without raising suspicion. A face rarely seen, an unchanging administrative presence. "And who is Arthur now?" Ethan asked. Thomas looked away. "It's still here." The sentence was followed by a dry sound coming from inside the castle. An ancient bell, one that Ethan had never heard before, rang out once. Thomas paled. "He knows you found out," she murmured. The castle, until then silent, sprang into action. Doors closed automatically. Locks were activated remotely. The feeling of isolation became absolute. Ethan understood, at that moment, that he was no longer dealing with vestiges of the past. He had triggered the active system that was still operating there. And for the first time since his arrival, he felt that perhaps he wasn't allowed to leave with the truth intact. After the solitary toll of the bell, the castle took on a new rhythm. It was no longer just an old, silent place. It had become a working machine. The air seemed heavier, as if each corridor was sealed not only by doors, but by decisions made decades ago. Ethan tried to remain calm. He walked down the main hallway, testing doorknobs. Most wouldn't budge. Some doors, once simple partitions, were now locked from the inside, reinforced with locks he hadn't noticed before. There was no announcement, no direct confrontation, just the silent confirmation that his freedom of movement had been curtailed. Thomas reappeared hours later. His demeanor was no longer that of a confident caregiver, but rather someone torn between loyalty and guilt. "You shouldn't have connected the dots," he said without accusation. Now the system needs to react. Ethan demanded to know what reacting meant. Thomas explained in short, calculated sentences that whenever a real threat arose, the castle went into an internal protocol: isolation, containment, assessment, not as immediate punishment, but as a method. This revelation had immediate consequences. Electricity only worked in specific areas. The external signal was completely cut off. Any attempt at communication failed before it even began. Ethan was, officially, out of the world. The emotional reaction didn't come in the form of open panic, but of constant tension. Ethan began to measure every step, every word. He started sleeping fully clothed, with his notebook always at hand. He noticed that food was left out at irregular times, always sufficient but never abundant, a subtle, calculated control. Meanwhile, Thomas grew increasingly unstable. In moments of silence, he seemed to observe the castle as one observes a living entity. At other times, he showed clear signs of regret. He mentioned Margaret only once, in a low voice. "She tried to go off script," he said. "The castle doesn't tolerate prolonged deviations." Ethan understood the weight of the phrase. Margaret hadn't simply been silenced. She had been absorbed by the system. In the lower corridors, sounds could be heard again. Not screams, not clear voices, but rhythmic movements, as if someone were being transferred from one wing to another. Thomas avoided those areas, but that didn't stop Ethan from noticing their presence. The consequences also accumulated internally. Ethan began to question his own choices. If he continued, he might never leave the castle. If he retreated, he would become an accomplice. The structure functioned precisely by placing its observers before this dilemma. In a moment of carelessness, Ethan realized that part of his notes had been copied. Someone or something was monitoring his progress with surgical precision. The castle wasn't just reacting, it was learning. At the end of that day, Thomas handed Ethan an old, heavy key, marked with a symbol he had seen before in older documents. "This leads to what's left of the center," he said. "After this, there's no turning back." Ethan's final reaction was non-verbal. He held the key, feeling its real and symbolic weight. He understood that the consequences of the turning point were already in motion, and that any choice from then on would define not only his destiny, but the future of the truth he carried. The castle had closed its doors. Now a decision was required. The old key remained in Ethan's hand for long minutes before he moved. It wasn't just an object, it was an invitation, or a sentence. He knew that by using it, he would cross a line that many before him had avoided or hadn't had the chance to choose. The corridor leading to the old central wing seemed narrower than before. Each step required concentration. There was no hurry, only determination. For the first time since arriving at the castle, Ethan wasn't reacting to his surroundings. He was directing his own actions. The door that the key opened didn't creak. It slid with mechanical precision, revealing a space unlike anything he had seen before. The center wasn't a place of brutal restraint, but of observation. Reinforced glass walls separated smaller rooms, each equipped with simple, almost clinical instruments. Chairs, tables, analog recording systems. No explicit violence, just absolute control. Ethan realized then the true mechanism of the castle, not to break bodies, but to bend wills. He found final records of the project, not as official reports, but as operational protocols. The individuals subjected to that system were chosen for their social vulnerability, not for guilt. The goal was not punishment, but predictability. Forgotten people were easier to erase. Unlike previous discoveries, Ethan didn't feel shock. He felt clarity, and with it, a definitive inner change. There was no longer room for moral hesitation based on fear. Thomas appeared at the entrance to the center. He didn't try to stop him. "If you follow it to the end, you won't be able to pretend you didn't see it," he said. "I don't pretend anymore," Ethan replied. The conversation marked a turning point. Thomas was no longer an obstacle, but a reflection of what Ethan could become if he yielded. Someone who knew the truth, but had chosen to survive in silence. Ethan's growth didn't come from grand speeches or gestures, but from practical decisions. He began to organize evidence redundantly. He hid physical copies in different locations throughout the castle. He prepared a clear, simple chronological record, impossible to reinterpret without explicit intent. He also began to act strategically, not impulsively. He observed the castle's patterns, isolation schedules, surveillance cycles, blind spots. He learned how the system worked. In one of the final files, Ethan discovered Margaret Hale's fate. She hadn't been removed. She had become an administrative part of the system, forced to maintain records until her identity completely faded. Her official death was merely the formal termination of a function. This discovery solidified Ethan's transformation. He wasn't there to physically destroy the castle. He was there to break its central logic. As he left the center, Ethan no longer felt the weight of constant fear. He felt focused. The castle remained imposing, closed, watching, but now there was something different. For the first time, someone inside its walls was not reacting to the system. He was challenging him intentionally. Ethan's transformation did not go unnoticed. The castle, attentive to deviations from the norm, began to respond with more aggressive adjustments. Isolation cycles became irregular. Lights went out in strategic sectors. Corridors that were once predictable began to close without warning, forcing calculated detours. Ethan interpreted this as a clear sign. The system had identified his change in behavior. The observation phase was over. Using old maps and center records, he traced a unique route, a path that connected the castle's administrative core to the old North Tower, where the original point of registration and authentication of the name Arthur Whitmore was located. It wasn't a symbolic place. It was functional. There, contracts were validated, identities preserved, and decisions made permanent. Thomas, increasingly tense, began to provide small pieces of information without being asked. Not out of sudden courage, but out of exhaustion. "The system doesn't react well to those who anticipate its moves," he warned. "It will force a shutdown." Ethan understood. The climax would not be brought about by direct confrontation, but by administrative closure. The castle didn't need to kill. It needed to neutralize. As he progressed in his preparation, Ethan finalized a package of physical and mental evidence. He separated key documents, cross-referenced records, and historical evidence that dismantled the narrative of the castle's legal continuity. The goal was not to denounce immediately, but to ensure that, if he was silenced, the material would survive. He also prepared Thomas for an inevitable choice. He showed him Margaret's final records, without accusations, only facts. Thomas read silently. His hands trembled. "If this comes to light," he said, "everything I've held together will crumble." "It's already fallen apart," Ethan replied. "All that's left is for it to stop pretending it's stable." Tension grew with each passing hour. Silent alarms were triggered, not audible ones, but logistical ones. Doors that should have been closed too early. Alternate routes disappeared. In the early morning, Ethan noticed the system's final adjustment. The castle was beginning to converge, all movements toward the North Tower. Not by chance. That was where everything needed to end. The final preparations were complete. There were no more subplots to resolve. The village, the clinic, Margaret, the unchanging name, everything pointed to that point. Ethan climbed the tower steps with firm steps, aware that the system had already calculated his arrival. The only variable the castle had not yet been able to foresee was simple but devastating. Ethan had no intention of negotiating. The North Tower was older than the rest of the castle. Each step of the spiral staircase seemed to have been shaped not to withstand time, but change. The walls were thick, almost windowless, and the air grew progressively thinner as Ethan climbed. There was no hurry. The system wanted him to arrive there, conscious of each step. At the top, the door was open. The tower's interior bore no resemblance to a traditional power room. There was no luxury, no symbols of authority, just a simple dark wood table, a set of metal filing cabinets, and an old terminal connected by cables that disappeared into the stone walls. Everything functional, everything essential. Seated at the table was a man of indistinct appearance. He didn't seem old nor young. His face conveyed no threat, only a studied neutrality, the kind of expression that invites neither empathy nor emotional confrontation. "Mr. Caldwell," he said without getting up, "you arrived exactly on time." Ethan didn't answer. He approached slowly, observing the open documents on the table. They were old contracts, some over a century old, all signed with the same name: Arthur Whitmore. "This system exists because it works," the man continued. "It solves problems the world prefers not to see. Invisible people, administrative errors, institutional excesses. The castle simply organizes what already exists." "No," Ethan replied for the first time. "It perpetuates." Arthur tilted his head slightly, as if assessing an unexpected detail. "You believe you can shut it down," he said. "But structures like this don't depend on individuals. They depend on continuity." Ethan pulled a set of documents from his backpack and spread them out on the table. Cross-referenced records, historical evidence, legal inconsistencies, physical evidence. It wasn't an emotional accusation, it was a technical dismantling. "Continuity requires legitimacy," he stated, "and you no longer have it." Arthur examined the papers in silence. For the first time, a trace of tension appeared in his eyes. "Even if all of this is exposed," he said, "the system adapts. A new name, a new function." Ethan approached the old terminal. He inserted the key Thomas had given him. The system recognized the access without resistance. Not this time. With just a few commands, he executed something simple and devastating: a formal closure. Not physical, but administrative. Internal records were closed, parent authorizations invalidated, the name Arthur Whitmore marked as an extinct identity with no legal successor. The system tried to react. Lights flickered. Distant doors slammed shut, but it was too late. Arthur stood up slowly. For the first time, he seemed smaller. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. "Yes," Ethan replied. "I made you visible." The silence that followed was unlike anything the castle had ever produced. It was not watchful. It was not oppressive. It was empty. Arthur took a step back, then another, without confronting, without running away, just ceasing. When Ethan descended the tower, he found Thomas waiting on the lower landing. The caretaker asked nothing. He merely observed the castle lights, which now remained steady, without automatic adjustments. "Is it over?" he finally asked. "The name is finished," Ethan replied. "The rest will have to face the world." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something new there. Not complete relief, but enough freedom to breathe. The castle remained standing. The walls had not crumbled, but its core had been broken, and with it the illusion that some truths could remain buried forever. The following morning dawned unceremoniously. The castle remained there, imposing and intact, but something essential had disappeared. There were no alarms, no belated reactions, no hidden mechanism attempted to reorganize itself. For the first time in decades, the place existed only as a structure. Stone, corridors, towers, without the invisible logic that governed it. Ethan walked through the halls with renewed attention. The doors remained unlocked. The electricity worked smoothly. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was ordinary, a silence that did not observe, did not evaluate, did not register. The consequences began to manifest themselves quickly outside the walls. State authorities arrived before noon, alerted by a chain of administrative failures, invalid contracts, contradictory records, funds automatically frozen due to the absence of recognized legal representatives. The name Arthur Whitmore no longer held any weight. Thomas watched everything from a distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't try to protect the castle or justify the past. His function, like the name that underpinned the system, had lost its meaning. "I've spent my life maintaining something that didn't need to continue," he said in a neutral tone. "I just needed to avoid being questioned." Ethan did not respond. There was no judgment to offer. Only the inevitable closure of a structure based on collective omission. The documents that Ethan had prepared began to circulate among investigators, independent historians, and legal bodies. Not as sensationalist denunciations, but as accurate reconstructions of the facts. The castle ceased to be a local myth and became a real, documented, and undeniable case. The village reacted with discomfort. Some residents felt relief, others fear, many silent guilt. The stability bought through silence was now exacting its emotional price. There was no revolt, no collective catharsis, only the belated recognition that normality had been sustained by absences. Before leaving, Ethan visited the library one last time. The books were still in place, but now they didn't seem to be watching over him. He left organized copies of the records there, not to erase the past, but to prevent it from being distorted again. As he passed through the iron gates, he noticed something simple, almost insignificant. They no longer creaked when they opened. They functioned like ordinary gates. The castle hadn't been destroyed. You didn't need to be. Your strength was never in stone, but in invisibility, and that was the end. Months later, the castle remained closed to the public, now surrounded by official plaques and ongoing legal proceedings. It was no longer a secret. It had become an object of study, debate, and historical unease. Thomas left the property in silence. No one officially recorded his departure. For the first time, it didn't matter. He no longer carried keys nor inherited responsibilities. Only his own identity remained, rebuilt far from the walls that had defined him for so long. Ethan followed the developments from a distance. No sensationalist headlines, just reports, hearings, and administrative reviews. The system wasn't replaced, it was shut down. The castle still stood, but now empty for a hidden reason. A monument not to power, but to what happens when silence is no longer obeyed. Some places survive the test of time. Others survive fear. Few survive the truth. Stories like this don't end when the last page is read. They continue in the questions that remain, in the silences that become unsettling, and in the structures we accept without ever questioning them. How many places still exist simply because no one dared to look closely enough? How many names remain untouched, not because they are legitimate, but because they are convenient? If this story provoked unease, reflection, or discomfort, it served its purpose. Share your interpretation. Do you believe the system would have truly been shut down, or merely forced to reinvent itself elsewhere under a different name? Leave your comment, share your reading with others, and say, how far would you go to expose a truth that everyone prefers to ignore? Some stories are fiction, others are simply waiting for someone willing to speak out.